Prologue to an Analogue by Leigh Richmond. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Prologue to an Analogue by Leigh Richmond. Finagle's law shows that many times we don't get the effect we planned on. But there's an inverse to that famous law, too. The IWC program was a newscast by Bill Howard, and the news was particularly vicious that night. Bill, his big homely face leaning across the desk toward the viewer, talked in horrified tones of the pest sub that had reputedly got stuck in the Suez and spread epidemic across Cairo. It was easy to assume, Bill told his audience, that the nations most interested in creating a crisis in the world right now had put the sub there to make an excuse to accuse us of the terror. It was undoubtedly really there, and was undoubtedly really of American make, and the epidemic was undoubtedly very real indeed, he said. The United Nations investigating team, due to go in the canal zone the next day and make their report to the world, would find that the epidemic was caused by laboratory-developed bacteria carried in by an American-made sub. It would be at least as bad, if not worse, than reported. The question before the world, Bill said, was not whether bacteriological warfare had started, but who had started it. And the fact that the sub carried United States markings and was of United States make did not at all answer the question. Bacteriological warfare had broken out, and where it would strike next was anybody's guess. But let there be no mistake, Bill said. This is war. It was on that note that the station break came, and the 13 Witches, trademark of the International Witch Corporation, came on. Harvey Randolph, manufacturer of the Witch line of products, leaned toward the screen intently. He had just transferred his account to Burton, Dester, Dustin, and Oswald, and they had dreamed up a new type commercial for the products. The 13 Witches were long-legged, slender dancing gals in tall black witch caps and long black capes, crimson-lined, and very little else. Each had long hair that swirled as she danced. Randolph chewed his lip, watching them thoughtfully. They came on with what was almost a Valkyrie cry. Witches of the world, unite, to make it clean, 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 witch clean, now. Thought Randolph. The cry struck rather sourly at the end of that "this is war" sentence from the newscast, he thought. But then that dramatic newscast ending was rather unusual. The witches were singing a jingling chorus as they danced. No need is too big, no task is too small, they sang. Which witch do you need? You should have them all. Each witch, of course, displayed her particular product from the witch line: detergent, soap, shampoo, cleanser, cleaning fluid. Which soap or detergent? Which cleanser upsurgent? Which witch do you need? You should have them all. This was fairly average as commercials go, thought Randolph. The big B-D-D&O radical innovation would be next. It was. On the screen behind the witches appeared a map of the Suez Canal, and then a papier-mâché model of the nose of a sub and a dockside shanty, a gray pall hanging over them. As the witches turned and began dancing toward it, the deep voice of the announcer spoke over the muted jingle. Witches of the world, unite! If Nasser had enough witches, he could solve the crisis which has us all in stitches. And the witches, in a united dance step, approached the sub and shanty singing, "Make it clean, 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 witch clean now." Each sprayed it with a witch product, and as they sprayed, the pall lifted, the sub and shanty showing shining, bright, new painted. "Clean, clean, clean," chanted the chorus. "Witch, witch, witch, clean, 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 defy dirt, defy disease." Keep witch clean. Well, thought Randolph. And then again, well. He wasn't quite sure, he told himself. The commercial came darn near being in poor taste, what with the crisis so near, and yet it wasn't something to make you forget the product. By Geoffrey, no. You'd think of witch products quite a bit after watching that one. He reminded himself to check the viewer reaction that would be available fairly early next day as he switched off the TV. It was almost noon next day before Randolph reminded himself of the call he planned to make to BDD&O. He got Oswald on the wire almost immediately. "Randolph here," he said. "I called you about that new commercial. It seems a little drastic. Are you planning on using it again tonight?" "Use it? We're taking full credit, in a witchery sort of way," Oswald laughed. "Never saw anything like your luck, Randolph. I've got the entire staff tied up doing the follow-up for tonight. You needn't worry about libel either. We've got the whole legal staff turned out, going over every detail." "It seemed pretty near the line to me," said Randolph, chewing his lip. He found himself a little puzzled over Oswald's tone, but not too much so. Any public relations man was over-enthusiastic by nature in Randolph's estimation. Maybe it took that to make a good PR man. People might resent our making hay out of sickness, even if you are preaching that cleanliness will prevent it. Sickness, you might have a point. I admit I'd argue it, but you might. But wellness, now, it's different. I do know that if the United Nations team reports there's no epidemic, and that the Pest Sub is one of the cleanest, healthiest crude submarines in the business, it's safe for us to assume that it's so, and to imply that witch products are used to keep it clean. Mr. Oswald, Randolph's voice took on a note of imperious prissiness, would you mind explaining just what exactly you're talking about? Haven't you heard the news? There's no bacteriological war. I admit that puts Bill Howard way out on a limb, but there are a lot of very fine people with him. There's no epidemic in Cairo. There's not even a bad cold that the United Nations team could find. And they give that so-called Pest Sub the most complete bill of health in the business. Now, the deal we planned for tonight." At the same moment, a number of very important people were closeted with the president. Their reactions to the United Nations report were quite otherwise than those Oswald was experiencing. "It's the exact timing and the detail of execution that scares me, Mr. President," the Undersecretary of State was saying. The Secretary himself was coming in by jet and would join them immediately on arrival. "It implies a technology that we can't touch even in our wildest dreams. I've talked to the CIA chief himself, and the reports from our operatives are beyond question. The epidemic was not only real, it was widespread. The Pest Sub was as real as this chair I'm sitting on, and its crew near death to the man, and no question about it. If they can fight a bacterial war and produce an overnight cure at the same time, we're at their mercy. There's no bomb ever developed or that can be developed to touch the power of what they've just demonstrated." The president ran his fingers through his hair. His face looked more drawn than any man had yet seen it. Yet he smiled. "We're not suing for peace terms yet," he said, and turned to the nation's foremost biologist sitting quietly in a nearby chair. "What's your reaction?" he asked. "We've always known," the answer came despondently, "that bacteriological warfare is far deadlier than any bomb, if there were any protection from its effects for the victor. We had a strain of bacteria once, for which we had an immunization course, and we developed it far enough along the line to realize that even though you immunized every man, woman, and child in this country in advance of releasing it in another part of the world, mutant strains would eventually wipe out this nation, as well as those we fought." "How about mutant strains of the Suez bacteria?" the president asked, then answered himself. "No, they've produced an antidote. An antidote, if our reports are correct, that works overnight. He shook his head slowly. The ultimatum should come very soon now, the president said. It is the timing. I do not understand the timing. The big man in the Kremlin was allowing himself an appearance of indecision that he did not often indulge before underlings. Of course, there was but the one underling, and any audience that proved to have a later embarrassing potential could be silenced with ease. Still, it was unusual, and the lieutenant who served as combination secretary and backstop for oratory quaked as he listened. The timing is all wrong, but the fact is a fact. It must be a fact, or every operative we have should be Siberianized. We must, of course, act. The action must be immediate. We are zeroed in. No! Vlada heard himself speak, and his whole body was outraged at the action. He stood white, trembling. But he had spoken, and try as he would, the word could not be pulled back. No? My little dove, and what would you suggest then, if we are not to defend ourselves from this capitalistic aggression? That we shall sit with our hands folded and allow them to dictate the terms of our surrender? Speak. Send them a pest sub and see if they can handle the bacteria we have developed. Vlada's throat was dry, and his voice was not his own. No power on earth could have made him open his mouth, but he had opened it, and he fully expected the lightning to strike him at that moment. Send them? Ah, of course. They can cure their own, and they have taken a so dramatic method of saying that they can cure their own. But can they cure the products of our laboratories? Now that we shall see. But we shall be as subtle, more subtle even, than were our capitalistic friends. We shall not send our sub to them. We shall send it to a small island, and we shall see whether they wish to taste the death, the strangulation and crippling and suffering, the destruction of sanity that shall be the lot of those islanders. In Peiping, the distress was no less acute, but the reaction was somewhat different. The scientist being grilled had no hope left. He could answer honestly, for there was nothing that could save him from that which was in store. The strain was virulent. There is no known antidote. Nothing could have saved that port, nor most of Africa and most of India, and there was no way for the world to know from whence came the death-dealing submarine, except that it be the mighty America. The bombs should have come in retaliation, spreading their death and adding to the impetus of the epidemic, so that enough of the world was wiped out to give the great people of the dragon room in which to expand. We calculated that a third of our own would be wiped out in the Holocaust, which would have relieved us of many problems. The tan peoples of India and the darker peoples of Africa should have sued us to lead them in a unity of the yellow peoples against the insanities of the pale people of the West. There is no antidote, yet the epidemic is destroyed. I cannot yet believe what is told me. I would go to my ancestors happily if I could go to them with the answer to this riddle. That night, Bill Howard came on the screen, his big, homely face wreathed in smiles, his tweed suit and shaggy blonde hair looking even more informal than usual. "It's a great day for the people of the world," he said. "There's undoubtedly tremendous political significance in what happened at Suez, and every statesman and every politician will have statements to make and conclusions to draw. Suez's obvious healthiness has been variously attributed to American technology, garnered from the experts we have sent them over the years, to Russian technology, garnered from their experts loaned to the nation involved, to Muhammad, and to the God of the Christians. The peoples of the world," he said softly, "are concerned with these things in the abstract, but mostly we the people are willing to leave this to the theorists while we rejoice. For we the people, who thought we faced that most degrading, that most unanswerable, that most horrible fate of all, bacteriological war, find ourselves at bacteriological peace. At the break, the 13 witches danced on, crying their chant, and behind them as a background was the bright, clean sub and shanty scene. Witches of the world unite to make it clean, clean, clean. Witch clean now, they chanted. Pestilence or peril, disease or disaster, stay clean, clean, clean. Witch clean. Ah, said the deep voice of the announcer as the jingle muted. Which do you really wish? Which is the modern method of cleanliness using the best of modern technology. And the witch is witching through the world. Randolph watched the program skeptically. The best lawyers and the best PR agents to be had, he reminded himself. Still, there was a nagging worry that this thing was going too far. It's okay to claim the moon, he thought, chewing his lip. But isn't it a little risky to claim peace on Earth for the witch products? He made a mental note to call BDD&O the next morning. The audience reaction would make itself felt by then, and he could decide. It was almost noon next day before Randolph reminded himself of the call he planned to make to BDD&O. He got Oswald on the wire almost immediately. Randolph here, he said. I called about that new commercial. It seems a little drastic to claim peace on Earth for the witch products. What are you planning for tonight? More of the same. Oswald's voice was jubilant. The switchboard has been swamped, and we're on almost every program, on every channel. They're taking us apart, of course. Witchcraft raises its head, and Salem is here with a new twist in a singing commercial. And anybody got a pestilence? That sort of thing. But they're crediting witch products from dawn to dawn. I sure didn't make a mistake when I tied our contract to your sales. We ought to break the bank. Randolph chewed the thought in silence. Oswald, he said, it's an old habit of the American people to make a joke out of what they can't understand. Sort of Paul Bunyan all over again. But don't overdo it. That Witches of the World Unite deal, remember the IWW? Wasn't that sort of communistic? Every time someone talks about getting the world peacefully together, about unity, someone starts shouting commie. Since when has communism and unity got anything to do with anything? You are an international corporation, aren't you? It's in your title, IWC, isn't it? You don't just sell witch things in the United States. You have markets in Europe and Africa and India and all over the place. Or I read the sales charts wrong. What's worrying you about using it? The overseas tapes are going like a cannonball express. Our ratings have skyrocketed everywhere, Oswald said in satisfaction. What do you mean, don't overdo it? You get the world in a hat basket, and then you want to throw it away? Incidentally, he added in a calmer tone, I got one crank call that's got me thinking. The guy got all the way through to me before he'd talk, and that takes some getting, what with the salaries I pay people to keep the cranks off my neck. He said that now we have the Witches of the World United, why didn't we do some real cleanup work, like slums and insane asylums? Got me thinking, you know. A good cause never did a program any harm. Randolph chewed his lip a while in silence, and Oswald, knowing his client, waited patiently. I like that a lot better than claiming peace on Earth for the witch products, Randolph said at last. Why don't you pick a slum we can clean up for not too much, and let's see what you can work out. This cleanup theme isn't bad. It's just peace on Earth that doesn't really belong to us, you know. I'll tell you what. We'll go to $50,000 or so on a cleanup job, and you use that. Leave the world to the politicians and the eggheads. After he hung up, Randolph stood by the telephone, still chewing his lip. Could you clean up something like a slum for, say, $50,000? Oswald would double the figure in his own mind, of course. Always did. But he'd get the sales out of it. His contract was tied to sales. Yes, he thought. It was best to call him off the track he was on now. Lawyers or no lawyers, that sort of thing was dangerous. It took a week, and it took every member of the staff that could be pulled off other programs, as well as the ones assigned to Witch. The slum had been located. 3 buildings in a short block just up from the Battery, surrounded by new buildings. It was a 1 privy to a floor, cold water only setup with a family living in every room. It existed on high-value land only because the land and buildings were tied up in an estate and couldn't be sold. But they could be remodeled and thrown into one, and contracts were signed, permissions granted. The paperwork alone filled nearly a complete file cabinet. It would take double the $50,000, of course, maybe more. But Randolph had authorized it, hadn't he? He always named half the figure, or less, than he meant to be used. Anyhow, international ratings and sales would more than make up the purse, because this thing would hit Sacco. Worry about the cash was the last thing that was bothering Oswald. He had a bear by the tail, and his contract price was tied to the gross. The show was ballyhooed the whole week while the work went on. Clean, clean, witch clean. What's the witch's next big cleanup? Witches of the world unite. Let's clean up this old world and make it livable. The night the new cleanup job was to show, Randolph tuned in his TV as ignorant of the details as the next viewer. It worried him a little that Oswald insisted on keeping him in the dark on everything except the fact that it would be a slum cleanup. But he had the best PR men and the best lawyers in the country working on it, he told himself. And certainly the sales charts for the past 2 weeks had been spectacular. We can count on the biggest TV audience of the year tonight, Oswald told him gleefully at noon. The build-up's been a natural, and those Salem with a new twist and a singing commercial plugs have been continued on this network. The cost of that was comparatively small. And I've even gotten them onto a few of the really big shows to boot. Bill Howard came on the screen, his big, homely face leaning across the desk toward the TV audience. The biggest news in the country right now, Bill said in a solemn tone, is the biggest single cleanup job in the country today. There's a slum, Bill said, right here in New York that the witches of the world will unite to clean up tonight. Then he put on the full power of the personality that made him the most listened-to newscaster on the air, TV and radio. The manner that made the news sound human, like it really happened to real people. He put it on full power and went to work. First, he showed a big map of New York and talked about how people thought of it as a big, impersonal place, but it wasn't. He made it everybody's hometown. Then he traced the map right down to the exact spot where the buildings were. Then he turned on a movie, and he showed the back door, garbage-strewn, and a room where a family slept, 7 of them, and the privy they shared with 5 other families. Then Bill turned off the movie, and he brought that family to the mic, each of them